Today's gospel reading is from Matthew chapter 18. You can find that on page 20 in the New Testament section of your Pew Bibles, starting with verse 23. For this reason the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, "Pay what you owe." Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed. They went and reported to their Lord all that had taken place. Then his Lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?" And in anger his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he should pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. The word of the Lord.
Remind you, the next Sunday being World Communion Sunday, we had our Global Witness Offering, and there's information about that in an insert in your bulletin. So please, we hope you'll be able to give to that very, very important offering. So apologies for not reminding you of that. I have a question for you this morning. Are you one of the 145 million people whose personal information may have been stolen through the lax security of the credit company Equifax? Are you? According to what I read in the news, if any of us did any type of business that involved a credit application of any type, whether on the buying or selling side, that information has probably been compromised. Now, Equifax knew this 5 months ago, in March, but waited until a few weeks ago to tell the public. And by no coincidence, isn't it interesting that that was just long enough for its senior executives to divest themselves of a massive amount of Equifax stock. Wow. How did that happen? Does that make you mad? Does that make you mad? That your personal information was stolen. Does that make you mad? Equifax obviously thought that it was going to make many people mad, as evidenced by their initial response to their customers. If one went to the website in those first days after they released the news, as many did, that person was directed to Equifax's Identity Protection Program, where they could be enrolled for free. How gracious of you, Equifax. But what Equifax didn't tell us was that after 1 year, anyone who signed up would start being charged the regular monthly cost of that protection. Equifax said nothing about that, but what they did say in the fine print of the free sign-up was that any signatory to this protection would give up their right to sue the company and agree only to a settlement involving binding arbitration. The public, on hearing about this, became so enraged that they actually got Congress to do something. Congress has called for an investigation. They're actually going to have hearings on this. How much do we trust these massive corporations to do the right thing? And how often do we find a reason to be angry with it? Kind of think about it. How often do we find a reason to be angry about anything? Some have called the current time in our culture the age of rage, and with good reason. It seems that anger has become a binding emotion for our nation, an anger that's sourced in fear and frustration and disappointment. If we're not angry about something, the primary question the culture asks us is, why not? You ought to be. It's not so much that the anger of this age is unreasonable. There are always things to be angry about. Not hard to be angry. But unmanaged and unresolved anger has only two consequences. Both of them are very bad. Rage or depression. The two extreme actions that result from these two emotional responses are equally bad. To anger, the reaction is violence. Violence for rage. Violence for rage. For suicide, the action is, for depression, the action is suicide. And both are going up. All over the place. But in between those extreme reactions, those extreme actions of rage, or violence or suicide, in between we find all kinds of harmful ways to act out our angry feelings, whether consciously or unconsciously. Jesus of Nazareth was the calm eye in the storm of emotions in a time which was very much like ours, a time of great anger and unmanaged rage. Jesus' community hated Rome to a level that is hard for us to understand, to comprehend. The closest thing I can come to it is the way Americans felt about the Japanese just after Pearl Harbor. Israel had been festering that kind of rage against Rome for centuries. But this anger against Rome was also complicated by the attitudes of the spiritual leaders of Jerusalem, who saw themselves as little more than enforcers of the temple's repressive religious laws. It is a fact that when a community centers its identity upon the legalistic enforcement of authority, oppression is never far behind. It's going to happen. The culture that surrounded Jesus had experienced the terror of legalistic oppression, both from Rome and Jerusalem, both secular and religious. And many within that culture were constantly trying to either bully or persuade Jesus to embrace their anger, to take up their call for the violent overthrow of their enemies, whoever those enemies happen to be. In response, Jesus gathered to him a community, an intimate community of followers to whom he taught a different way of living in an unjust world. A way guided not by self-destructive anger, but by transcendent faith in the ultimate justice of a good and loving God. No teaching of Christ exemplifies this way of living better than the parable of the unforgiving servant, the parable that you just heard. The story is intentionally extreme in its elements. Some of Jesus' parables have grounding in reality. This one is almost a cartoon in its extremity. And I don't only mean that facetiously. It's meant to be exaggerated. A king calls to account his indebted slaves in order to settle debts. The importance of Christ's introduction to the story is that the king is willing to negotiate with those who owe him, even though a regent had complete freedom to judge and punish for whatever reason. One of the servants who comes before the king owes a ridiculous amount of money, unrelated to any realistic debt. 10,000 talents was the equivalent of 300 tons of silver. An unimaginable sum. In fact, the Greek word for 10,000, the ancient Greek word, is myriad, root of our English word myriad. And myria was the largest number in the Greek language. There was no number bigger. So the way we might translate this idea is that the slave owed the king gillions of dollars. That's literally how it's written. The slave owed the king gillions of dollars. The king's judgment in response to the debt is fair regarding both his authority and the law. He orders the slave and his family to be sold, along with all of their possessions. Basically, it is a death sentence, as the family will be cast out into the street, and they'll die. But the slave falls on his knees and begs for mercy, and makes an absolutely ridiculous promise out of sheer desperation. If the king will just be patient, the slave will pay back everything that he owes. Now, the disciples, of course, who heard Jesus' story knew that such a debt could never be repaid. And they would expect the king of this story to justifiably scoff at such a ridiculous offer. But shockingly, in the story, the king accepts the settlement. Christ makes it clear that the motive for the king in forgiving such a massive and unpayable debt has absolutely nothing to do with the slave, and everything to do with the compassionate nature of the king, who literally, in that moment, chooses love over justice, love over law. Now, Jesus could have ended the story, of course, at that point, and it would have been a great lesson of God's grace. But his parable is not just about the nature of God, it's also about our nature. No sooner does the slave leave the presence of the king than he runs into another slave who owes him a more realistic debt. One that is truly payable. 100 denarii, which represents about 2 or 3 months' wages at that time. The slave doesn't even say anything. He grabs his debtor by the throat in an absolutely uncalled for act of rage, to which his debtor responds with a plea for mercy, using the exact words, by the way, not coincidentally, that the first slave used before the king. Have patience with me, and I will pay you. In a twist that would have shocked the disciples, the first slave eschews mercy and exacts justice according to the law, throwing his debtor into prison. Which legally he has the perfect right to do. Though the first slave has done justice according to the law, the other slaves in the kingdom recognize the great injustice of his act in light of, in the context of, the mercy he received from the king. A mercy which transcends legalism, a mercy which embraces compassion. When they tell the king of his slave's actions, the king is clearly infuriated and responds by punishing the slave, not for the debt that the king originally forgave, but punishes the slave for not reflecting the king's remarkable mercy by showing a little bit of mercy of his own. And in anger, his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. Jesus concludes the shocking parable with an equally shocking conclusion. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you, speaking to his disciples, every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. While the disciples may not have understood what Christ was trying to teach them at that time, they certainly would have understood it after the death and the resurrection of the Messiah. And we who believe in that Messiah, looking back on what Jesus did for us now, are certainly without excuse. We can't say, well, that's a great story, but we don't know what it means or we don't know what happened. Can't do that. What Jesus accomplished on the cross leaves us with an unimaginable debt, a burden we can never repay. The very essence of God, as shown in the life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ, is one of compassion and mercy, especially in the face of injustice. Think about this. At the heart of the Lord's Prayer is a very dangerous phrase. We say it by rote. Do we think about what we're saying? Listen. Forgive us our debt as we forgive our debtors. Think about that. That's a knockout statement. In other words, Lord, I expect you to forgive me with as much compassion as I show to those who owe me. So in other words, Lord, I'm giving you free rein. If I don't forgive, it is justice for you to not forgive me. Think about that before you pray them. What we are praying when we say that is the very point of the parable of the unforgiving servant. Forgive us, Lord, in the same manner, to the same degree that we forgive others. Now, why would Christ ask us to make such a prayer in a world that's constantly inflicting things upon us? Things we have to react to, respond to, things we have to forgive. Well, he asked it first because compassion and mercy reflect the very nature of our Creator and the essence of what it means to be created in God's image. That's why. But second, Christ asks us, demands of us to do this, because it is also for us, for our spiritual and physical and emotional health. 18th century Christian author and playwright Hannah More, M-O-R-E, Hannah More, who was raised in a strong Presbyterian family in England, wrote these eerily prescient words long before anyone understood the connection between emotional and physical health. Listen to what she says a long time ago. Forgiveness is the economy of the heart. Forgiveness saves the expense of anger, the cost of hatred, the waste of spirits. Pretty amazing. What insight. Forgiveness is the economy of the heart. Moore's words are not hard for us to understand. Forgiveness is as much for us as it is for those whom we forgive. Forgiveness is our final settlement, not with those who wrong us, but with God who settled our massive debt through the love of Jesus Christ. Christ's parable is even stronger in making this point. We have no choice but to forgive. Now, forgiveness doesn't mean we stop trying to right wrongs or end injustice, or we walk away from wrong things, or we just simply forget the bad things that have happened in our lives, or the things others have done to us. Of course not. I mean, look at the life of Martin Luther King Jr. He spent his own life right up to his martyrdom engaged in fighting injustice. But he also said this: forgiveness is not an occasional act. It is a constant attitude. In fact, if you think about that, what he said, his very attitude of forgiveness is what drove him to act on behalf of others. It doesn't mean forgive, okay, fine. No. It means forgive and go and help others learn how to forgive. So do we have that attitude? An attitude which is directly proportional to our settlement with God. If we accept God's gift of grace, then grace is what we owe to God and to God's creation. To do anything else leaves us in a situation best described by my favorite writer, Anne Lamott, who wrote this: not forgiving is like drinking rat poison, then waiting for the rat to die. Put that on your refrigerator. Not forgiving is like drinking rat poison, then waiting for the rat to die. Her point is well taken. Hate poisons our hearts. But Christ has given us an antidote, the answer to this age of rage: forgiveness, compassion, mercy. And because God made that choice for us, we have no other choice to make for others. God gave us settlement. We must settle as well, but most importantly, we must settle for ourselves so that we can have peace. Real peace. The peace that passes understanding. Amen. As we come to our meditative hymn, number 442,